In the rigid world of the British monarchy, silence is usually the most powerful language, which is why the moment Sarah Ferguson was rumored to have spoken at all sent a quiet shock through royal circles. It did not arrive with a press conference or an official statement, but through whispers, second-hand accounts, and fragments repeated just often enough to feel deliberate. For decades, Sarah has occupied an unusual position in royal life, close enough to know the machinery from the inside, yet distant enough to survive without its protection. When reports surfaced that she had allegedly linked Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew in ways the public had never considered, it immediately raised a far more unsettling question than whether the claim itself was true. The real question was why a woman who has learned the cost of speaking out would risk doing so now. The atmosphere surrounding the royal family has rarely been more brittle. Trust has thinned, public patience has worn down, and every unresolved scandal seems to sit just beneath the surface, waiting for the slightest provocation. In that climate, even an unverified remark can function like a match near dry paper. Sarah knows this better than most. She has lived through exile, ridicule, financial collapse, and the slow, painful effort to rebuild a public image that never fully recovered. Her loyalty to Andrew, unwavering even as his reputation collapsed under global scrutiny, has defined her recent years. That loyalty has cost her patronages, credibility, and comfort, but has also shaped her identity as someone who stands her ground when others disappear. So when insiders claimed she had alluded to a prior familiarity between Meghan and Andrew, long before Meghan's relationship with Prince Harry ever began, the implication cut deeper than gossip. It threatened the emotional spine of a story Harry himself has repeated for years, the story of falling in love with a woman entirely untouched by royal life. Timing is everything in royal narratives, and this timing is impossible to ignore. Sarah and Andrew are no longer protected by status or duty. Their long residence at Royal Lodge has come under pressure, and whispers of downsizing have carried an unmistakable message about relevance and hierarchy. At the same time, the symbolic suggestion that Frogmore Cottage, once associated with Harry and Meghan's break from the institution, could become an option for the Yorks has only sharpened the sense of irony. In moments like this, narratives collide. Old grievances resurface, and people who feel sidelined begin to speak not because it is safe, but because remaining silent offers no protection either. What makes this moment especially volatile is not the alleged content of Sarah's remarks, but the way they challenge a carefully maintained timeline. Meghan's public image has long rested on the idea of being an outsider who entered the royal sphere without prior ties, learning its customs only after falling in love. That narrative has served as both shield and justification for decisions that followed, from interviews to relocation. If even the suggestion arises that this timeline was incomplete, it introduces doubt where certainty once existed. Doubt does not need proof to be damaging. It only needs space, and silence provides plenty of it. Sarah's own history complicates how her words are received. She has been candid to a fault, sometimes unfiltered, often punished for speaking where others remain quiet. Critics argue that this makes her unreliable, driven by frustration or a desire to redirect attention from her own controversies. Supporters counter that her proximity to Andrew's private world gives her insight few others possess. Both interpretations can exist at once, which is precisely why the situation feels so unstable. In royal life, credibility is rarely absolute. It is weighed against motive, history, and consequence. What hangs in the air now is not confirmation or denial, but discomfort. Neither Meghan nor Harry has addressed the reports directly. Sarah herself has not publicly clarified what she did or did not say. The palace, as expected, remains silent. That collective quiet has transformed a rumor into a pressure point. When no one speaks, every possibility remains alive. For Harry, the implications are said to feel intensely personal, not because of public opinion, but because the story he has defended with such devotion appears, for the first time, vulnerable to reinterpretation. This is how modern royal crises begin, not with documents or declarations, but with an unexpected fracture in a familiar story. A woman long considered peripheral suddenly occupies the center of attention, not because she sought it, but because her proximity to the truth or the perception of it cannot be ignored. Whether Sarah Ferguson revealed a buried reality or simply ignited speculation through ill-timed candor remains unknown. What is clear is that her alleged words have reopened questions the monarchy would rather keep sealed, and once those questions surface, they rarely disappear quietly. Long before her name became shorthand for scandal and survival, Sarah Ferguson entered the royal orbit as an outsider who never quite learned the art of quiet obedience. She was not raised inside palaces or trained to disappear behind protocol. Her upbringing, shaped by absence, independence, and emotional hunger, formed a personality that valued connection over control, warmth over restraint. When she married into the monarchy, that instinct clashed immediately with an institution built on distance. From the start, Sarah struggled to fit into a system that rewarded silence and punished spontaneity, and that tension would follow her for decades. Her early years inside the royal family were marked by public affection and private unease, moments of joy overshadowed by a constant awareness that she was being watched, measured, and judged by standards she had never been taught to meet. Her bond with Prince Andrew grew out of shared vulnerability rather than ambition. Andrew, born into privilege yet emotionally sheltered by the monarchy, found in Sarah someone who offered loyalty without calculation. Their relationship was passionate and intense, but it was also ill-suited to the rigid expectations placed upon them. When their marriage eventually collapsed, it did not sever their emotional connection. Instead, it froze it in an unusual state of permanence, a bond that survived divorce, scandal, and public humiliation. Over time, Sarah became not just Andrew's former wife, but his most consistent defender, the one person who remained when others withdrew. That loyalty, while deeply personal, would later define how the public interpreted her actions, including any words she might speak in his defense. After stepping back from formal royal duties, Sarah entered a long period of reinvention that was never fully successful. Financial trouble, questionable associations, and relentless media scrutiny followed her attempts to build an independent life. Each misstep reinforced the perception that she was careless, even reckless, yet it also highlighted a pattern that would become central to her story. Sarah did not retreat when things went wrong. She absorbed the consequences publicly and kept moving, often misjudging the line between candor and caution. That history matters because it frames how any alleged remarks are now understood. When someone with nothing left to protect speaks, observers must decide whether they are witnessing honesty or desperation. Across the Atlantic, Meghan Markle emerged from a completely different world, one shaped by ambition, image management, and performance. Her early life and career trained her to navigate visibility, to control narrative, and to understand how stories function as currency. Before entering royal life, she had already learned how perception could be shaped, refined, and leveraged. That skill set would later become both her strength and her greatest point of contention. To her supporters, it signaled intelligence and self-awareness. To her critics, it suggested calculation. When Meghan stepped into the monarchy, she carried with her an instinct to explain herself, to speak, and to frame events in her own words, an instinct that ran directly against an institution accustomed to shaping stories through silence. Her relationship with Prince Harry was built on the promise of escape from a system he had long resented. Harry's childhood losses and lifelong distrust of the press left him yearning for a narrative that felt pure, protective, and untainted by royal games. Meghan appeared to offer that refuge. She was presented as someone untouched by palace politics, someone whose lack of familiarity with royal customs symbolized authenticity. That framing became emotionally central to Harry, reinforcing his belief that he was finally choosing love over obligation. Over time, it also became central to their public identity as a couple. Understanding these parallel histories is essential to grasp why the current situation feels so combustible. Sarah's life has been shaped by proximity to secrets and exclusion from power. Meghan's has been shaped by mastery of narrative and a desire to control how her story is told. Andrew's history carries unresolved shadows that still threaten the institution. Harry stands at the intersection of all three, emotionally invested in a version of events that gave meaning to his most consequential choices. When these trajectories intersect, even hypothetically, the result is not a simple scandal but a collision of identities. The monarchy itself provides the backdrop that amplifies every tension. It is an institution that depends on carefully managed appearances, inherited credibility, and an unspoken agreement that private matters remain private. Over time, that agreement has eroded. Media's saturation, memoirs, documentaries, and interviews have shifted power away from the palace and toward individuals willing to speak. Sarah's long marginalization placed her outside the traditional channels of control, while Meghan's rise coincided with a cultural moment that rewarded personal testimony over institutional silence. Andrew's downfall exposed the limits of royal protection, showing that even blood ties could not fully shield misconduct from public judgment. Against this background, the idea that past social circles might overlap no longer feels implausible, even if it remains unproven. Elite worlds often intersect quietly, without public acknowledgement, through charity events, private gatherings, and shared acquaintances. The suggestion alone challenges the simplicity of the outsider narrative and reintroduces complexity where clarity once existed. For some observers, this possibility reinforces long-held suspicions. For others, it feels like an unfair attempt to rewrite history. What matters is not which side is correct, but why the story resonates so strongly now. At its core, this unfolding tension reflects a deeper struggle over who controls truth in a system built on image. Sarah's past shows a woman repeatedly punished for speaking too freely. Meghan shows a woman criticized for speaking too strategically. Andrew shows a man shielded for too long, then abruptly exposed. Harry shows a man desperate to believe that the story he chose was real. These histories converge in a moment where silence and speech carry equal risk. Nothing has been conclusively proven, yet the emotional groundwork has been laid for doubt to thrive. What transformed long, simmering tension into something unmistakably volatile was not a document, a photograph, or a recorded statement, but the sudden sense that a private understanding of the past was no longer stable. Reports began circulating that Sarah Ferguson had alluded to specific moments, places, and social environments in which Meghan Markle and Prince Andrew may have crossed paths well before Meghan ever became publicly linked to Prince Harry. The details varied depending on the source, but the effect was consistent. The story shifted from abstract suspicion to a challenge against a timeline that many had accepted without question. It was no longer about whether such encounters could have happened, but about what it would mean if they had, and why that possibility felt so threatening now. For years, Harry's account of how Meghan first encountered royal life had been treated as a cornerstone of their shared narrative. In interviews, documentaries, and his memoir, the moment was framed as almost disarmingly ordinary, a woman unfamiliar with royal hierarchies, mistaking status for staff, navigating introductions with genuine confusion rather than strategy. That image carried emotional weight. It supported the idea that Meghan entered his life free of palace influence, and that his decision to walk away from royal duty was driven by love rather than calculation. The alleged claims attributed to Sarah did not accuse Meghan of wrongdoing in any legal sense, but they did something more destabilizing. They implied that the story might not have begun where Harry believed it did. What followed was not an immediate public response, but a widening silence that only intensified speculation. Royal observers noted that neither side rushed to clarify. The absence of denial, particularly from Meghan's camp, was interpreted in conflicting ways. Some saw it as a disciplined refusal to amplify gossip. Others saw it as hesitation, the kind that suggests complexity rather than simplicity. Meanwhile, Sarah herself remained publicly quiet, which only deepened the intrigue. Those close to her suggested that her words had been exaggerated or stripped of context, while critics argued that ambiguity was precisely the point. In a world where every phrase can be dissected, ambiguity becomes a powerful tool, allowing a story to expand without ever being fully owned. Behind the scenes, attention turned to the emotional consequences rather than the factual dispute. Insiders described Harry as unsettled, not because he feared headlines, but because the suggestion struck at something deeply personal. For someone who had long framed his marriage as a rescue from the suffocating weight of royal life, the idea that Meghan might have been less removed from that world than he believed introduced an uncomfortable internal conflict. It raised questions that could not easily be dismissed by public relations strategy. If even a small part of the timeline was inaccurate, what else might have been simplified or left unsaid? This was not about betrayal in the conventional sense, but about the fragility of belief when it is built on trust rather than verification. The broader royal context made matters worse. Andrew's past associations had already placed him at the center of intense scrutiny, and Sarah's unwavering loyalty to him had tied her reputation to his fate. When whispers emerged that she had spoken from first-hand familiarity with his private social sphere, observers immediately questioned motive. Was this an attempt to share truth as she saw it, or a defensive maneuver designed to redistribute attention away from Andrew at a moment when pressure was mounting again? Reports that the Yorks were being encouraged to vacate their longtime residence added another layer of vulnerability. When status and stability are threatened simultaneously, people often reach for the one resource they still possess, their voice. The palace response, or lack thereof, followed a familiar pattern. No official statements, no corrections, no visible intervention. Yet sources suggested that discomfort ran deeper than usual. This was not a tabloid rumor easily dismissed. It involved individuals whose stories had already reshaped public perception of a monarchy in recent years. Meghan and Harry's departure had challenged the institution's authority over narrative. Andrew's disgrace had challenged its ability to contain scandal. Sarah's marginalization had exposed the personal cost of falling out of favor. The alleged revelation seemed to touch all three fault lines at once, creating a sense that the institution was once again being tested by forces it no longer fully controlled. Public reaction reflected that unease. Commentators split into familiar camps, but even among those accustomed to royal drama, there was a sense that this situation felt different. It was not fueled by leaked messages or paparazzi photos, but by the implication that a foundational story might be incomplete. In modern media culture, incompleteness can be more damaging than falsehood. It invites endless interpretation, allowing audiences to project motives and meanings that hard facts would otherwise constrain. The silence from those involved left that interpretive space wide open. As days passed, the focus shifted from whether the claims could be proven to whether they would be addressed at all. Analysts noted that legal action would be unlikely unless concrete accusations were made, and that a forceful denial could risk reigniting attention. Yet doing nothing carried its own risks. Each unanswered question hardened into assumption, and each assumption took on the weight of possibility. For Harry, friends suggested, the strain was less about public judgment and more about private reckoning. When the narrative that once offered clarity begins to blur, even loyalty can feel uncertain. The emotional stakes extended beyond the Sussexes. Sarah's own efforts to rebuild her image after years of missteps appeared once again in jeopardy. Charitable ties had already frayed, and public patience with royal figures associated with controversy was thin. If her alleged remarks were proven unfounded, she risked being cast as reckless, willing to damage others to protect her own interests. If they contained truth, she risked confirming suspicions that the royal family had long suppressed inconvenient realities. Either outcome placed her in familiar territory, standing alone amid criticism, insisting that context mattered while the world debated motive. What made this episode particularly resonant was its human dimension. At its heart, it was not a legal case or a constitutional crisis, but a story about trust under pressure. The monarchy has always depended on controlled storytelling, but this moment revealed how vulnerable those stories become when personal relationships intersect with public myth. Harry's understanding of his marriage, Meghan's carefully constructed public image, Sarah's reputation for candor, and Andrew's unresolved shadow all converged in a single, unresolved question. Did the past unfold exactly as it has been presented, or was it more complicated than anyone wanted to admit? As speculation continued, the sense grew that resolution would not come quickly, if at all. The longer silence persisted, the more the story seemed to take on a life of its own, feeding off uncertainty rather than evidence. Observers noted that this was precisely how royal controversies in the modern age evolved, slowly, persistently, without a single defining moment, but through accumulation of doubt. Whatever the truth, the alleged remarks attributed to Sarah Ferguson had already achieved something irreversible. They had reopened a narrative many believed was settled, and in doing so, had forced everyone involved to confront how fragile certainty can be when the past refuses to stay fixed. The consequences of the alleged revelation did not unfold through a single dramatic confrontation, but through a slow, grinding shift in atmosphere, the kind that alters relationships before anyone fully realizes what has changed. For Prince Harry, the impact was described by those close to him as deeply internal. He has spent years positioning himself as someone who chose transparency over tradition, truth over silence, and love over loyalty to an institution that failed him. The suggestion that the origin story of his marriage might be more complex than he believed did not simply threaten public perception. It unsettled the emotional logic that had justified his most irreversible decisions. Friends say he became quieter, more withdrawn, not engaging with the noise, but unable to escape the questions it raised. When a narrative has carried someone through exile, family rupture, and public attack, discovering cracks in that narrative can feel less like embarrassment and more like loss. For Meghan Markle, the fallout was equally intense, but manifested differently. Her strategy of silence was interpreted as both strength and vulnerability. Supporters argued that refusing to respond denied oxygen to a rumor built on speculation. Critics countered that silence, when paired with a history of carefully curated storytelling, invited suspicion. The longer she remained quiet, the more commentators dissected her past interviews, looking for inconsistencies that might support or undermine the claim. What had once been framed as confidence now risked being read as calculation. The pressure was not only external. Insiders suggested that the emotional toll of once again being discussed without context, without control, reopened wounds from earlier confrontations with the media. Each day without resolution extended the sense of exposure, forcing her to balance self-preservation against the risk of letting others define her story. The ripple effects extended beyond the Sussex household. Sarah Ferguson found herself pulled back into a spotlight she had spent years trying to manage rather than dominate. Her efforts to rebuild credibility after repeated controversies were suddenly overshadowed by speculation about her motives. Charities and former allies watched carefully, weighing whether her alleged comments reflected honesty or recklessness. Even without confirmation, the perception that she might have spoken out of loyalty to Prince Andrew reinforced a narrative that she would risk her own standing to protect him. That perception carried consequences. Invitations cooled, support hesitated, and the fragile progress she had made toward rehabilitation appeared to stall once again. Yet there was also a quieter reaction, a recognition among some observers that Sarah had always existed outside the comfort of royal approval, and that her willingness to speak, however costly, was consistent with the path she had long chosen. Andrew himself remained publicly absent, but his presence loomed over every discussion. The alleged connection, whether real or imagined, dragged him back into public conversation at a moment when he was already fighting to maintain a semblance of stability. Reports that he and Sarah were being encouraged to leave their longtime residence added a tangible sense of displacement to the controversy. Losing a home, even one steeped in privilege, symbolized a deeper erosion of status. For someone whose identity had been anchored in royal position, each reminder of diminished standing carried psychological weight. Observers noted that any story drawing him into renewed scrutiny, even indirectly, compounded the sense that his past would never fully release its grip on the present. Within the palace, the situation reportedly created a low-level but persistent unease. The royal family has long relied on the belief that time and silence eventually dilute controversy. This episode challenged that assumption. The lack of clear facts did not cause the story to fade. Instead, it allowed uncertainty to persist, and uncertainty proved corrosive. Staffers accustomed to deflecting gossip found this case harder to dismiss, not because of its veracity, but because of its emotional implications. It intersected with existing fractures between branches of the family, reopening tensions that had never fully healed. The absence of official response was interpreted by some as restraint, by others as paralysis. Either way, it underscored how limited the institution's options had become when dealing with narratives shaped outside its control. Public discourse reflected this complexity. Rather than uniting around a single interpretation, audiences splintered further. Some viewed the alleged remarks as a long overdue challenge to what they considered a manufactured image. Others saw them as an unfair intrusion into a marriage already subjected to relentless scrutiny. What was striking was how quickly the conversation moved away from facts and toward feelings. Trust, credibility, and intention became the dominant themes. The story resonated not because it offered answers, but because it mirrored a broader cultural anxiety about authenticity. In an age where personal stories are currency, the possibility that a foundational narrative might be incomplete felt unsettling. The emotional consequences also touched Harry's relationship with his family. Though no public statements were made, commentators suggested that renewed tension lingered beneath the surface. Years of distance had already eroded easy communication, and this situation threatened to widen that gap further. When a person feels uncertain in their private life, reconciliation becomes harder, not easier. Every gesture risks misinterpretation. Every silence carries weight. For Harry, who has spoken openly about the pain of familial estrangement, this added layer of doubt may have deepened a sense of isolation he thought he had already accepted. For Meghan and Harry together, the strain was described as subtle but real. Insiders emphasized that unity remained, but acknowledged that prolonged speculation tested emotional resilience. Conversations reportedly turned inward, focusing less on public defense and more on reassurance. When the world questions a shared story, couples are forced to confront how much of that story they truly need to share. The pressure to clarify competes with the desire to protect intimacy. That tension, unresolved, can linger long after headlines fade. Ultimately, the consequences of this episode were not defined by any confirmed truth, but by the damage uncertainty can inflict. Reputations stalled, relationships strained, and an institution already struggling with relevance found itself, once again, unable to dictate the narrative. The situation illustrated how modern royal controversies rarely explode all at once. Instead, they seep into the fabric of daily life, altering perceptions incrementally until something feels irreversibly changed. Whether the alleged connection proves meaningful or meaningless, its impact has already been felt in quieter ways, through doubt, distance, and the uneasy awareness that some stories, once questioned, never returned to their original shape. Away from headlines and commentary panels, the story took on a quieter, more intimate shape, built from fragments shared by those who had watched the key figures navigate private moments long before this controversy emerged. Friends of Sarah Ferguson have often described her as someone who speaks most freely in informal settings, where conversation drifts between memory and emotion rather than strategy. In those spaces, she is said to reflect on the past with a mix of nostalgia and frustration, replaying moments she believes were misunderstood or deliberately simplified. It is in this context that some insist her alleged remarks were never intended as an accusation, but as an observation rooted in familiarity with the social rhythms of a world few outsiders ever see. Elite circles, she has reportedly noted before, are smaller than they appear, and people cross paths more often than public narratives suggest. Those close to her describe a woman who feels she has paid dearly for loyalty. Years of defending Prince Andrew have narrowed her circle and hardened public opinion, yet she has rarely wavered. In private, she is said to justify this steadfastness not as blind devotion, but as a promise she made long ago, one she believes defines her integrity. That internal logic matters because it shapes how she interprets events. When others retreat for self-preservation, Sarah tends to lean in, convinced that silence equals betrayal. Friends suggest that this instinct, admirable to some and reckless to others, may explain why her words, however loosely shared, carried such weight. Meanwhile, accounts from those who have observed Meghan Markle away from the cameras paint a picture far more complex than the polarized images that dominate public debate. Acquaintances from her early career describe someone acutely aware of social dynamics, attentive to hierarchy, and skilled at adapting to unfamiliar environments. This adaptability, praised in professional settings, later became a source of suspicion within royal culture, where instinctive ease can be mistaken for calculation. People who knew her before royal life insist that she learned quickly who mattered in any room, not out of ambition alone, but as a survival skill honed in competitive spaces. That background complicates the idea of total unfamiliarity with elite networks, even if it does not confirm any specific connection. In private conversations, Meghan is said to have expressed exhaustion rather than fear. The repeated resurfacing of questions about her past, especially those framed without context, has reportedly taken an emotional toll. Friends claim she feels trapped between two unsatisfying options: responding and reigniting scrutiny, or staying silent and watching assumptions grow. The strategy of restraint, while outwardly calm, requires constant emotional discipline. Each rumor forces a calculation not just about public image, but about personal boundaries. Those close to her suggest that this balance has become harder to maintain as speculation drags on, testing patience that was already thin after years of relentless attention. Within Prince Harry's inner circle, the focus has been less on facts and more on feeling. Friends describe long conversations that drift late into the night, circling around trust and memory rather than headlines. Harry, they say, is not preoccupied with disproving claims, but with understanding how narratives form and why they matter so deeply to him. His lifelong struggle with institutional secrecy has left him hypersensitive to the idea that truths can be withheld in the name of protection. In private, he has reportedly wrestled with the uncomfortable possibility that complexity does not always equal deception, and that some stories are simplified not to mislead, but to make sense of overwhelming change. There are also quieter voices from within the broader royal ecosystem, former aides and acquaintances who remember how stories were once shaped deliberately, with omissions considered a form of courtesy rather than dishonesty. These individuals suggest that what is now being debated as a potential contradiction might once have been dismissed as irrelevant detail. In a culture that prized discretion, not every prior acquaintance warranted acknowledgement. That perspective clashes sharply with modern expectations of full transparency, highlighting a generational shift in how truth is defined. What once passed as harmless omission can now be recast as strategic silence. These unspoken tensions reveal why the current situation feels so emotionally charged. It is not merely about who met whom and when, but about how much of one's past must be disclosed to be considered authentic. For Sarah, authenticity has always meant speaking plainly, even when it backfires. For Meghan, it has meant shaping a narrative that protects her sense of self amid constant exposure. For Harry, it has meant believing that honesty is the antidote to inherited secrecy. Each approach collides with the others, creating misunderstandings that deepen rather than resolve conflict. In the absence of clear resolution, small gestures take on outsized meaning. A delayed appearance, a carefully worded comment on an unrelated topic, a conspicuous absence from a public event all become signals interpreted through the lens of suspicion. Those close to the situation say that behind the scenes, there's a growing awareness that the longer this ambiguity persists, the harder it becomes to reclaim control over any version of the story. Yet there is also fatigue, a sense that responding might only prolong a cycle that never truly ends. What emerges from these quiet accounts is a picture of people caught between past and present, each carrying private memories that do not fit neatly in a public myth. The tragedy, if there is one, lies not in any single claim, but in the way unresolved histories resurface when trust is already strained. In such moments, even innocent recollections can feel accusatory, and even silence can sound like confession. These are the stories that rarely make headlines, the internal negotiations, the emotional recalibrations, and the small, human efforts to preserve dignity while the world debates meaning from afar. As the noise gradually settled into a tense, watchful quiet, attention began to shift from accusation toward meaning, from immediate reaction toward what this episode revealed about legacy and power. For Sarah Ferguson, the moment underscored a lifelong pattern, a woman defined less by formal authority than by endurance. Her story has never been one of triumph, but of survival within an institution that rewards invisibility and punishes deviation. Over time, she has come to represent a particular kind of royal figure, one shaped by proximity to privilege, yet permanently outside its protection. Whether her alleged words were fair or flawed, they reflected a voice forged through consequence, a voice that speaks not to preserve status, but to assert relevance in a system that quietly discards those who fall out of line. For Meghan Markle, the implications were more abstract but no less profound. Her legacy has been built around the idea of rupture, a woman who challenged tradition by refusing to disappear into it. She reframed royal life as something that could be questioned publicly, a move that resonated with millions while alienating others. This episode threatens not her achievements, but the coherence of the story that has framed them. Legacy depends not only on what is done, but on how it is remembered. When doubts creep into a foundational narrative, they do not erase accomplishment, but they complicate interpretation. Meghan's challenge now lies in navigating that complexity without surrendering the agency she fought so hard to claim. For Prince Harry, the situation invites deeper reflection on the cost of certainty. His journey has been marked by a rejection of inherited silence in favor of emotional honesty. He has spoken openly about pain, grief, and betrayal, believing that truth-telling offers liberation. Yet this moment reveals a quieter lesson, that truth is rarely singular, and that belief, once shaken, cannot be easily restored through explanation alone. Harry's legacy may ultimately hinge on how he reconciles this tension, whether he can hold space for nuance without retreating into defensiveness or denial. The strength of his position has always rested on empathy. Preserving that empathy in the face of doubt may be his greatest test yet. Hovering over all of this is the unresolved shadow of Prince Andrew, a reminder that some legacies are shaped by absence rather than presence. His withdrawal from public life has not erased the impact of his past, only transformed it into a lingering discomfort that surfaces whenever old connections are questioned. This episode illustrates how unresolved accountability distorts everything around it, pulling others into its orbit even when they seek distance. Andrew's story serves as a cautionary backdrop, demonstrating how institutions that fail to address misconduct decisively leave space for speculation to thrive. The monarchy itself emerges from this chapter looking less like an immovable structure and more like a fragile narrative enterprise. Its authority has long depended on continuity, the idea that roles and rituals transcend individual missteps. Yet modern scrutiny exposes the limits of that model. Stories once managed through discretion now circulate freely, shaped by personal testimony rather than official decree. The institution's reluctance to engage directly with controversy reflects an older logic that time will dilute outrage. Increasingly, that logic appears outdated. Silence no longer guarantees resolution. It often amplifies uncertainty. What this episode reveals is a clash between eras, between an older understanding of legacy rooted in restraint and a newer one defined by disclosure. Sarah's instinct to speak, Meghan's instinct to frame, and Harry's instinct to reveal all emerge from different responses to the same system. Each response carries risk. Speaking invites backlash. Framing invites suspicion. Revealing invites vulnerability. None offers absolute protection, yet all are attempts to assert control over how one is remembered. Legacy, in this context, becomes less about reputation and more about influence. The question is not who appears flawless, but whose story endures with integrity. For Sarah, integrity has meant loyalty, even when it costs her. For Meghan, it has meant self-determination, even when it invites critique. For Harry, it has meant emotional truth, even when it complicates family bonds. These choices do not resolve conflict, but they define character. They shape how future generations will interpret this period of royal history, not as a single scandal, but as a turning point in how power, narrative, and personal agency intersect. The enduring lesson may be that legacy is never fixed. It evolves through retelling, challenged by new perspectives and revised by shifting values. What feels destabilizing now may later be understood as part of a broader transformation, a moment when rigid structures were forced to confront human complexity. In that sense, the current uncertainty is not merely disruptive, it is revealing. It shows how deeply people care about truth, not because it is neat, but because it matters. As the story continues to hover unresolved, the legacy of each figure involved remains unfinished, shaped as much by what they choose not to say as by what has already been spoken. The final meaning of this chapter will not be determined by rumors alone, but by how those at its center respond to ambiguity, whether with defensiveness, reflection, or quiet resolve. As this chapter draws toward its uneasy pause, the story settles not into resolution, but into reflection. The questions sparked by the alleged remarks attributed to Sarah Ferguson remain unanswered, yet their impact has already been felt in ways that go far beyond rumor. What began as speculation about a past connection has evolved into a broader meditation on trust, memory, and the cost of public storytelling. In a modern royal landscape, where every silence is interpreted and every word is archived, the absence of clarity becomes its own kind of statement. It forces everyone involved, and everyone watching, to sit with uncertainty rather than escape it. For Prince Harry, the moment represents a crossroads. He has long framed his life as a departure from secrecy, a commitment to openness as a form of healing. Yet this episode suggests that openness does not always deliver the comfort it promises. When belief is challenged, even gently, it demands introspection rather than defense. Those close to him suggest that what weighs most heavily is not the fear of public judgment, but the quieter realization that stories, even sincere ones, can simplify realities too complex to capture in a single telling. How Harry carries this realization forward may shape not only his marriage, but the moral authority he has built around speaking his truth. For Meghan Markle, the silence continues to function as both shield and test. Her decision not to engage publicly has preserved distance from the immediate storm, but it has also allowed others to fill the void with speculation. The balance she must strike is delicate. To speak risks reigniting narratives she has spent years trying to move beyond. To remain silent risks ceding control of her story to voices less sympathetic. In that tension lies the paradox of modern influence. Power is gained by visibility, yet sometimes protected by restraint. Whether her silence will ultimately be read as dignity or deflection remains an open question, one that only time, and perhaps future choices, will answer. Hovering at the edges of this story is the unresolved presence of Prince Andrew, whose past continues to shape the present through association rather than action. His withdrawal from public life has not erased his relevance to royal discourse. Instead, it has made him a symbol of unfinished reckoning, a reminder that when accountability feels incomplete, its consequences ripple outward indefinitely. Any narrative that brushes against his name inherits that weight, regardless of intent. The monarchy's struggle to manage his legacy underscores a larger institutional challenge: how to contain the impact of unresolved history without confronting it directly. What ultimately emerges from this final stretch is not a verdict, but a reckoning with how stories function in a world where personal lives are inseparable from public meaning. The royal family has always relied on carefully curated narratives to maintain stability. In recent years, that control has fractured, replaced by a patchwork of personal accounts, media interpretations, and public emotion. This episode highlights how fragile coherence becomes when multiple versions of the past compete for legitimacy. It also reveals how deeply people crave certainty, not because it guarantees comfort, but because it offers orientation in a landscape of conflicting truths. The human cost of this uncertainty should not be overlooked. Behind the analysis and speculation are individuals navigating private strain under relentless observation. Relationships absorb pressure in ways that are not always visible. Through cautious conversations, reassurances repeated, and doubts quietly examined. These internal processes rarely make headlines, yet they shape outcomes far more profoundly than public reaction. Whether bonds strengthen or fray under such scrutiny depends less on facts than on resilience, empathy, and the willingness to accept imperfection without assigning blame. For observers, the lasting impression may be less about the specifics of the allegation and more about what it reveals about power and transition. Authority no longer rests solely with institutions. It shifts toward those who can command attention, frame narrative, or withstand prolonged scrutiny. Sarah's candor, Meghan's composure, Harry's vulnerability, and Andrew's absence each represent different responses to that shift. None is entirely safe. None is entirely wrong. Together, they illustrate a system adapting, sometimes clumsily, to a world that no longer grants privacy by default. As the story pauses rather than concludes, it leaves behind a question that extends beyond royal intrigue. How much truth does the public deserve, and how much complexity can it tolerate? In an era that demands authenticity, the line between honesty and oversharing grows increasingly thin. The legacy of this moment will not be decided by confirmation or denial alone, but by how those at its center navigate the space between what is known, what is believed, and what remains private. For now, the silence holds. It invites interpretation, but it also offers time. Time for reflection, for recalibration, and for the possibility that understanding does not always arrive in dramatic revelations. Sometimes it arrives slowly, through the acceptance that stories, like people, are rarely as simple as they first appear.